A very good morning to one and all of you, and my very, very special thanks to Dr. Arulmozhi Varman to include me in his course. Much of what I'm going to say would have already been said, but then toric IOL is one subject where you don't mind many things being reiterated, because each time when you go through the contents, there's some more clarity which evolves and takes you further. So essentially, the whole thought is directed as to how to get to a very ideal status as what we want in the toric IOL to realize the final actual part. So it necessitates that we go through all the pertinent issues, and it starts, it's like a cascading event, right from biometry to optimization of IOL, the whole route. Every minor mistake in any of these steps could be quite hazardous in realizing a final optimal outcome. So I would be dealing it with how to ensure a precision in our IOL part in the pre-op measurements, the intra-op and the post-op. Firstly, in the pre-op status, the most intrinsic feature is to look at the dry eye status and ocular surface abnormalities or epitheliopathy. If these are addressed, it would ensure that our measurements are clear and more accurate. There are so many measurement devices are included. Like if you really want to be accurate, you wouldn't do just a manual K. You would want to use a topographer. You would want to know about the posterior cornea. You would want to go on to all the essentials which come all the way through. So these are the measurement devices. If these are not calibrated, it could impact your results. Again, when we are talking about keratometer, there are certain challenges here. Different keratometers measure at different points. Some at 2.5 millimeters, manual at 3 millimeters. The lens star has a double ring. And if you're looking at a post-refractive cornea, it's either 2 oblate or 2 prolate. So there is a challenge. But honestly, if you want the greatest accuracy in your results, ideally, it should be something as close to the center as possible, which we need to realize is not feasible. Then again, if you want to be even more accurate, you should even go and optimize all your IOL constants and your surgical induced astigmatism. But on this context, when you're talking about surgical induced astigmatism, there is a whole new information which we have now, because which came up with Barrett, wherein he says that any incision which is less than 2.4 millimeters induces astigmatism of just 0.10 diopters. That tells us that all those calculations for your surgical induced astigmatism, which we're doing all along, is not relevant, and most of our surgeries are less than 2.4. Again, optimizing the IOL constant is another very specific way to get greater accuracy in your calculations, for which I would have shown in the previous slide. You would have to go on to the www.warrenhill.com and feed in your 30 cases or feed in all the pre-op data which they want. Then you could get your IOL constant for that specific IOL. Then again, Dr. Ramesh beautifully described about the posterior cornea. Essentially, you need to have a Schlemm-Flunk device which will help you to measure the posterior corneal astigmatism. And majority, 90% of the situations, the posterior cornea is steeper. So it acts like a minus lens. And it acts like a minus lens and induces astigmatism in the horizontal meridian. Thus, it creates with the rule, against the rule, astigmatism. So then there was a study done which actually calculated in different measurement devices, and it found that if the posterior cornea is not taken into calculation, there is a trickle-in of error of 0.5 to 0.6 with the rule astigmatism, and 0.2 to 0.3 for an against the rule astigmatism, which needs to be kept. Going back, then what it tells us is, if your anterior cornea is with the rule and the posterior cornea is against the rule, then the total corneal power is going to become less. If both the anterior and posterior cornea are against the rule, your total corneal power becomes more. So therein will the errors which would start trickling in. So what would happen is, you would end up overcorrecting with the rule astigmatism and end up with a different result, or you might end up undercorrecting and against the rule astigmatism. So there were two major breakthroughs, the Baylor's nomogram and the Barrett's calculator, which definitely refined our understanding of the toric IOL. Very briefly on the Baylor's nomogram, basically he comes out with some personalized averages and how to go about calculations. But what you understand from that is he tells us to leave the eye with a little with the rule astigmatism so that it could compensate for the against the rule drift which is going to come in with the age. And then he also tells us that what he tells us is that keeping in mind that the posterior cornea is going to have its impact, the little bit of surgical induced astigmatism having its impact. So if you are having a with the rule, you could start implanting a toric IOL from 1.7 diopters. Whereas, if you have an against the rule, because of the additive effect of the posterior corneas against the rule, you could actually 0.4 will become a lot more. So you could start implanting your IOL even with a 0.4 diopter of Torycity, which is measured on the anterior cornea, as has been shown here. So then, taking you further on, the other important thing which you need to understand is the Torycity ratio. Basically, the astigmatism in the corneal plane is what is manifest at the IOL plane. And there is a Torycity ratio, IOL plane by corneal plane. And what would happen is, in a high myope, the ratio is different. In a hyperope, the ratio is different. Whereas, if you just stick to the average Torycity ratio, which comes in all the IOL calculators, you would be again inducing some kind of an error, because in an average pseudophakic eye, the measurements are average. So then this major analysis came in, which tells, if you have an axial length of 20 and you have a corneal power of 41, then what you would use Torycity ratio 1.33 would be incorporated in your calculations to make it more effective. So in other words, what are the factors which affect this Torycity ratio, which is a small component, but everything adds on to your accuracy besides doing an optimal surgery. So one is the power of the IOL, and one is the effective lens position. And believe me, if your effective lens position is not accurately noted, 1 millimeter of error trickles in a 0.1 diopter of error in your final toric IOL power. So then what can happen, which we need to beware, is in shorter eyes, that is hyperopic eyes and eyes which have a flat K, you would end up overcorrecting, and in big eyes and with a steep K, you would end up undercorrecting, and this has to be kept in mind. Then, having told you all of this, the Barrett's toric calculation is another major breakthrough, because it takes care of all these issues which were discussed. It's sort of like in one-step formula. You just have to enter the basic data which you are entering, like the K and the steep K, flat K, axial length, anterior chamber depth. And what it does is, it takes care of the posterior cornea, the effective lens position, it writes the centroid value for you. It does customization of the K index depending on which keratometer we are using, and then it tells you what should be your lowest residual astigmatism if you choose a particular power. The Alcon toric IOL has also incorporated this Barrett's algorithm, and it takes care of these things. But again, supposing you don't have all these exotic equipments, if a person has a with the rule cornea, you know there could be overcorrection. So if he needs a T4, you could step down to T3. And if he has an against the rule astigmatism in the front cornea, anterior cornea, instead of T4, you could step to T5, and then you would have incorporated for those errors which would trickle in. Again, marking challenges has been beautifully discussed, how iTrace had the Zaldivus calipers. You mark the 3 o'clock and the 9 o'clock, and if you place the patient on the iTrace, it will tell you how off axis you are, and you could incorporate it. You need to beware in large capsular bag, there'll be because of the larger bag, there's lack of equatorial friction, there is a challenge of rotational stability. You need to understand that what could happen is, if you do an anterior capsular polishing, the bag adherence may be less. So to have a IOL bag complex adherent, probably you should not do an anterior bag capsular polishing. Again, the IOL material, Acrysoft seems to be very good. If you could get a good centration of your rexus, it would ensure that there is this ideal wraparound of the rexus capsular bag over the IOL, which will again ensure that the toric IOL continues to remain in its axis. But going further, intraoperatively, you have the Aura, you have the Callisto, you have the Varion, which ensures that you can be even more accurate in the measurements, like you could register the eye initially, and then you could make your precise incision, Then you would have your capsular rhexis overlay. So it would be a virtual marker. Like if you use any of those capsular rhexis manual markers, you need to keep in mind the magnification effect of the cornea. But here it's a virtual marker. So if you follow that virtual tracing, you would get the exact size of rhexis. You enter as 5.5, you would get close to 5.5. And then going on with the surgery. And further to that, once you have implanted the toric IOL, the toric axis comes in, which helps you to lock the IOL in that position. Again, going further, Aura is another device wherein what it does is, in your aphakic mode, you could make your calculations. It tells you what is the IOL power which has to be measured. And then once you have placed the lens, it will tell you whether you're a little off axis, what adjustments to be done. So intraoperatively, that's one major measure. Finally, what could happen is you've done all this thing excellently to the last letter, but finally you have had a malrotation and you see a patient has a UCV of 612 and is utterly unhappy with you. So then you could enter these details in the www.astigmaticfix.com online, and then you could place the patient, you could go ahead with the surgery. You should remember not to inject viscoelastic, open the side port incisions and inject, and with the irrigation fluid on, you have already marked what should be the final IOL position, which you had gone wrong. So then you just gently separate the bag from the capsular overlying rhexis, position it optimally in that position, and then hydrate the wound. Even while removing the speculum, there could be a possibility of the IOL rotating. So finally see whether it's in the optimal position. So there is so much more we can go on and on about toric IOL. But it just tells us that if we are perfect, besides our surgical way of doing it, we are closer to target emmetropia. Thank you.